I'm Nigel Kobold, and this is the Lizard Wizard. The Lizard Wizard is a spell blade and intelligence caster that rocks boss encounters and open world with crushing weapon art damage and spellcasting versatility. We are going to be focusing on making the best use of some of the new sorceries where we can and they fit, but we'll also be bringing back some classics from the base game just to round things out. By default, we're a bit of a glass cannon. We've got low armor, we've got low poise, but we have ways of working around that. That said, I will show a variation of the build that does have 51 poise and doesn't sacrifice damage if that better suits your reptilian taste. That said, I really like the fantasy of the low armor version. The Spellblade set really screams eccentric hedge wizard to me. Like, you know, this guy didn't go to Ray Lucaria. They were learning from lost tomes and trading favors for knowledge with apostates like Selen from the get-go. And that really fits with the, somewhat ridiculous nature of the Lizard Greatsword. So let's get into it. Our main weapon is, of course, the Lizard Greatsword. Not only is this Greatsword a lizard, it actually mechanically rules. The obvious part, of course, is it shoots a projectile on your heavy attack, and this can be great for poke, finishing something off, and it kind of gives you a little quasi-skill maneuver, because if you land the poke just right, you can hit with the projectile and the attack, doing some pretty good damage. Even if it didn't have that, though, the lizard has got a lot going on for it. It's got very low requirements with only 12 strength and 14 dexterity, but it also deals strike and pierce damage. Strike damage on a greatsword. It rules. We infuse this with the new Carrion Sovereignty Ash of War with the magic affinity. You can totally go cold if that's more your style. I tried to test the damage on this and it seemed like somewhere between 4 to 7%. You get more damage with magic, but if you like doing cold, go for it. Carrying Sovereignty gives us a chargeable magical greatsword that comes down with a vertical slice and can then be followed up with a horizontal sweep. This thing is a bit of a menace. It deals solid stance damage. When fully charged, you've basically taken your lizard into full-blown blue dragon, and it does very scary damage. But I think something that's slept on a bit with this Ash of War is actually you can use this completely uncharged and it is still going to hit really hard and comes out really fast. For our spellcasting focus, we are going to be using the Carrion Regal Scepter. It's got the best pure intelligence scaling. That doesn't cost our spells to cost more FP. That said, if you do want to go for the classic Comet Azure move, this build can do it. Not a bad idea to boost up Luthat's staff if you want. And part of the beauty is, you really can switch out your spells and set up to any intelligence variant with this. In our offhand, we're going to hold the Maternal Staff. We're going to be using 3 out of 4 of the new finger sorceries, so this will boost those. We will also make use of the new Mesmer Soldier Shield. The shield has really solid guard boost when fully upgraded, and it also boasts really nice even defenses. It's got 43 elemental guard against all of them, so you're not really surprised when you get blown up by the wrong element. And when we enhance it with Scholar Shield, it really brings it up to almost Great Shield level of defenses, which makes it really nice out in the open world for doing some guard counter play if you're trying to really save your FP a bit. And lastly, we also have a dagger with Golden Vow. It's hard to pass that up. Alright, armor. For our armor, this is where we can go 2 ways. And it'll very much depend how much FP you want. If you're sticking with 150, when we go glass cannon, you're going to have 173. But with 51 poise, you're going to have a much more meager 121. Trading points between mind and endurance. Once again, only if you're sticking at 150. For context, that's really taking, 4 full Carrion Sovereignties with the follow-up versus 3. That being said, depending on your starting class, you might be able to squeeze a few more points into mind than I can as a Confessor. Our default armor, and what you'll have been seeing me use, is the full Spellblade set. Each piece gives a 2% damage increase to magic damage dealing Ashes of War, and this is the basket we will in fact be putting our lizard egg into, the Ash of War. That said, very little armor and an effectively nothing amount of poise, but we'll use some consumables to get around that. If you want 51 poise, we will go for the Rakshasa Helm, Armor, Greaves, but then still the Spellblade's Glove. This brings us up to 53 poise. We still get the 2% damage boost because Rakshasa Armor does that to everything. Technically, your spells are actually a little bit better with this setup, but I really like the Spellblade set. I feel like it goes a lot better with lizard wizard type vibes, but you can take your pick, mix and match, or just use whatever fashion works for you. It's going to hit very hard regardless of your armor choices. Getting into Talismans, we actually have a few setups to consider. Out in the world, I like to run Magic Scorpion, Godfrey Icon, Shard of Alexander, and Blessed Blue do Talisman. Get a little FP regen, damage boost to our magic damage, particularly when charged, and then even more so for the Ash of War. For bosses, I would for sure swap out Blessed Blue Dew for something defensive, either Dragon Crest Shield or something to counter a specific element. And if you're having trouble, I would also consider swapping out Magic Scorpion for a second defensive talisman. I will say if you want to go all in on damage, you could possibly run the Ritual Sword Talisman here as well, but that is assuming you're not going to use the blood-sucking crack tier in your physic. If you find yourself moving to spellcasting more, I would probably recommend about the same, but swap out Shard of Alexander, maybe the Godfrey Icon, depending on if you're charging your spells or not, for Graven Mass Talisman and Radagon Icon for the cast speed. If you're just doing one, I would actually recommend Radagon Icon more. Cast speed just makes it so much easier to get a spell off and still dodge the boss when they come for you. But that's mostly my preference. Getting into our stats, I'll show mine, but they are getting kind of out of control at this point. So next to it, I will show the two different level 150 builds, one with more mind, one with more endurance, which gets up to 53 poise. So we take our vigor to 50 for solid health. We take our mind to either 20 or 30, depending on your armor. Similarly with endurance, we take it to either 20 or 30, much the same. We go 12 strength and 14 dexterity to meet the minimum stats for the lizard, 80 intelligence for our spells and Ash of War damage. Go for your minimum faith, it's 14 for me. Minimum arcane, 9 for me. Like I said before, depending on your starting class, you might be able to squeeze a bit more mind since Confessor isn't really ideal for an intelligence caster. Consumables. So, probably no surprise, it's been around since before the DLC, but for consumables, you will want to have the option of using the Iron Jar Aromatic to provide a very serious 40% physical damage negation. Just don't use it against anything that's going to do lightning damage. You'll be slow, you'll be doing fat rolls, but outside of big attacks, you won't be staggered, which lets us ignore our negligible poise. That said, I do want to say you don't need to go into every attempt trying this. I would recommend going in first, seeing how the boss feels. On a lot of bosses, I'll actually just use Boiled Crab for some extra defenses and focus on making the most of an opportunity after dodging. So I'd say, if you're not familiar with the boss, which you probably are at this point, but go in and feel it out. Some bosses do enough heavy attacks, or you can stance break them with something like Glintstone Nails. You might be able to get an opportunity to charge it up without sacrificing your dodging abilities. So play around, you've got good options. For our physic, we will for sure be using the Magic Shroud and Crack tier for 20% increased magic damage. Your second option can go a few different ways. For generally Goose, Opaline Hard tier is great, it helps boost up our low defenses. If you're going to go for that comic Azure thing, obviously take Cerulean Hidden Tier for no FP for 10 seconds. I personally find myself going for a little bit riskier play and taking the Bloodsucking Crack tier. Despite how this reads on the tooltip, this is just 20% increased damage. You're going to lose health fairly rapidly. If you remember Power Within from Dark Souls, it's basically that. So combining this with all of our other damage boosts can get really scary numbers on carrying Sovereignty. For a great rune, I would go with Dawn. It increases your health, FP, and stamina. It is all stuff we want. And at last, we get to our spells. And this is where I really try to round things out for general gameplay. So we are going to take Glintstone Nail. This is your standard basic attack spell. Does solid damage, can be charged, has pretty good range, and a relatively low FP cost. And kind of an interesting and generally good tracking. It can turn on a dime and will sometimes snipe enemies you'd otherwise miss. That said, I find it works best if you try to set it up, shooting directly at an enemy. Works better when it seems to work on hard angles rather than a curve, so keep that in mind. But great for picking off an enemy or two from a group or doing some poke damage when you need it. Next up is Glintstone Nail. This spell shoots out a handful of nails in front of you. It does decently more damage than Glintstone Nail, but you're really here for the fact that it actually deals really nice stance damage on bosses. So on bosses where I might be having a bit of trouble making good use of carrying Sovereignty, maybe they have a lot of abilities that will knock you back even through the Iron Jar. This is a really good one, and a lot of times that stance break can give you the opportunity to use carrying Sovereignty on them. Next up is Glintstone Ice Crag, and this spell is just here to apply Frostbite. Taking 7% of a boss's max HP is great, but increasing all damage they take by 20% for 30 seconds is kind of the bigger reason we're here. Next up is Spiral Shard. Spiral Shard is our large hitbox boss killer. So things like the Furnace Golems and Ulcerated Tree Spirits get absolutely ripped apart by this. I don't think it's on Pest Thread Spears level, but it is certainly enough that it makes an otherwise kind of annoying encounter for the Furnace Golems, at least in my opinion, really quick and easy. If you can line this up to go through like both legs of a Furnace Golem or kind of through the trunk of an Ulcerated Tree Spirit, you'll get really good numbers. Next up is Gravitational Missile, and fair warning, this spell is very loud. I feel like it is louder than other spells. Maybe it's just me. Just have to note that first. While this spell can be used great effect at range, its real specialty is being launched into the floor or a wall and immediately blowing up, dealing pretty good damage, knocking enemies onto their backs. It's like, oh, in a pack of enemies? Launch this into a floor. Fighting a Black Knight and it's kind of getting in your face? Launch this into the floor. Fighting an NPC style enemy? Okay, you get it. And you can chain this like fully charged back to back, and it can trivialize a lot of tough enemies and NPC encounters. It's really good. Next up is Fleeting Microcosm. This is my preferential ranged area of effect spell. It can also do that kind of knockdown chain on a single enemy, but it's got moderate range. It has 2 explosions, the first doing a little and being smaller, and the last one being quite heavy damage and quite large area. I love using this to wipe out groups of enemies. From what I've seen, it currently doesn't benefit from Godfrey icon, which is a bit weird, but still worth charging up. Next up is Terra Magica. This buffs our magic damage by 22.5%, and if we can get away with standing on it, we should. But I really do want to say, don't feel like it's mandatory. It's better to get damage off safely than get blasted trying to position yourself in this. See which boss you're fighting, and if it seems like you're going to be able to set yourself up in a little area, you don't have to be directly on top of this, just pretty close. Next up is Scholar Shield, and I really like this one. It really robustly increases our defenses, and I use this out in the world. I use it for bosses. It lasts a minute, It reduces stamina damage on blocking by 35% and guarded damage negation by 30%, 70% if it's magic, which basically means we're blocking, we become fairly sturdy even against elemental damage, and in the world it allows for a really clean guard counter setup, and even against bosses it's sometimes useful, but dodging or becoming iron on bosses over blocking with this. But I like it out in the world. It allows you to stretch your FP quite a bit. And lastly, we have Ranni's Dark Moon. So this can be tough to get off. Don't stress if you can't, but in an ideal world, we open with this one on bosses. It reduces their magic damage negation by 10% for a minute. It does 270 frostbite buildup. The ideal thing, and this is definitely easier if you're either using summons yourself or if you are summon helping someone. We launch this, we do a few ice crags to proc frostbite. This is getting a multiplicative 32% reduced magic negation, so that's a huge boost to our damage. Getting that in order, plus Terra Magica, our Talisman, Physics buff, Golden Vow, you can see where a lot of the buffs are stacking up for crazy numbers. But I really want to say, don't think of these as like, oh man, I've got to get all of these in order. It's more like, how many can you reasonably get? Because you can get yourself killed a lot of times in a row just trying to stack all of these up. But that's the build. It's a lot of fun seeing numbers getting this high, and even just taking out some bosses comically quickly, like faster than I think I've ever taken out some bosses before. I don't normally do the make damage really, really, really big. Just my personal playstyle, but I can kind of see why people do it now. It can be a bit of a pain to get all the buffs and debuffs going to max things out, but like I said, don't stress too much about that. But when you can kill a boss in 2 to 3 Ashes of War, it does feel pretty good. If you like the video, leave it a like. If you're so inclined, maybe a comment. I love to read them. And if you want to see more builds from me, you might very recklessly consider subscribing to the channel. I would be pretty stoked about it. Either way, thanks for watching. Good luck.